Good? All right, so this is our history of the world in 50 minutes for our slow test on Wednesday. We're starting with populating the planet. And of course you guys know that all human beings originated, according to science, from East Africa. All right, a couple 100,000 years ago we had Neanderthals, eventually Cro-Magnon man, making it all around the planet. The reason why they could make it to all these places was because during the Ice Age, water level of the planet was much lower, and so these continents like Australia and the Americas, all of them were connected together. Right? And of course, these were nomadic people following herds of animals, hunter-gatherer groups of no more than about 35 to 70 people max. And the population of the planet at this time was around about 1 million. In fact, a lot of anthropologists believe that certain parts of our history we were down to about 10,000 people total on the entire planet. That's about a tenth the population of Newton County. Our early civilizations all occurred along river valleys. All right? We have the Egyptian along the Nile River, Mesopotamian along the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus River Valley, and of course Chinese, Yellow River Valley. The oldest civilizations came out of Mesopotamia. In fact, I saw yesterday that ISIS is actually blowing up a lot of the archaeological sites of these oldest civilizations. We're never going to have them again. All because, you know, they have statues of gods, and of course they're against any other gods besides Allah. But we're talking 5,000 years ago when civilization gets going in these areas. Egypt, of course, was one of our oldest civilizations. And why was the Nile River so much better than the Tigris-Euphrates? Anyone remember? Regular flooding. Regular flooding made it so much easier to predict when the flood's coming, made you much more prosperous with your farming. Mesopotamia had a lot of people coming in and out, a lot of war going on here. Indus Valley was much more peaceful because of the natural barriers. You had the Himalayas here. It's more secluded. We found a lot of sanitation, advancements for that, but not really much for anything else. China develops about 1,000 years after these other civilizations. They were known for their pounded earth building tactics. This is when we're talking Shang Dynasty. So our early empires. Persia. Persia they came out of southern, what is today Iran, and they took over all of really the Middle East, Egypt, and into Europe. What made Persia so great was the fact that they were inclusive. We talked about how Cyrus, who was mentioned in the Bible as being this great and wonderful guy, when he took over places, he didn't force his religion on you, he didn't enslave you. He basically just said, okay, if you follow my rules and pay my taxes, we're fine. And that's why the Persian ruler was called the King of Kings, because in the Persian Empire you basically still had smaller monarchs who were just loyal to the Persian king. They had the royal road, which allowed for massive trade. They had a really great army, which eventually was, of course, defeated by the Greeks and then Alexander the Great. And the Hellenistic Empire, this is the empire created by Alexander the Great. Remember, Alexander came from Macedon. He eventually conquered all the Persian Empire, although he didn't live very long. He died very young of an illness, and even though he did have a son and an heir, he was murdered, and all his friends divided up the empire. And so we had the Seleucid, the Ptolemaic, the Antigonids. And even though the empire didn't last very long, what did last was the fact that you were sharing all this knowledge and all this culture of all these different regions. So you had India, Persia, Egypt, Greece, Europe, all this coming together. And that's really what Hellenistic culture is. It's an accepting and a merging of other cultures together, which is, of course, a great thing. All right? When humans share knowledge, we actually end up being much more prosperous. China. Now, China is one of our oldest civilizations. We talked about how they had the dynastic cycle. This was what the Zhou came up with to get rid of the Shang kings. The idea in China was that the gods let us know when they're unhappy with the ruler. So if we got a ruling family and all of a sudden there are earthquakes and famines and droughts, then obviously the gods are upset and the gods want us to get rid of that ruling family. And so a new dynasty would emerge. And of course, they would take over, they would prosper for a while, but then you'd have other natural disasters. And everyone would start to think, oh, well, that family's lost what they call the mandate of heaven, or the favor of the gods. And then they would be replaced. So we constantly see dynasties changing in this cycle. Yes?
Is there like a name for that?
A thing meaning?
Like a name.
Yes, they call it the dynastic cycle, and the idea of the gods supporting you is called the mandate of heaven. Right? This is the yin and yang symbol, which was still is today the symbol of Taoism, which was one of these native Chinese religions. This is a statue of Confucius, probably the most famous Chinese philosopher of all time. And this, of course, is a statue of Mahayana Buddha, not the original Buddha. I have these three in here because they all came about in this period of the Zhou dynasty. We call this in China the Warring States period. Confucianism and Taoism were designed to bring back law and order to China, right, because they had lost it for so long. Also legalism as well, which was used by the Qin dynasty eventually to unite all of China together. Here on this map you can see the movement of Buddhism out of India. Buddha, as you all know, was an Indian prince who established a new religion that was all about being nice to everyone else. They believe in dharma and karma and reincarnation like most of your religions of India. But Buddhists basically believe that the more good karma you build, the more you'll be rewarded in the next life. And also that you can eventually reach a state of enlightenment called nirvana, where if you totally understand and are at peace with the universe, everything just is good. It's not like super awesome, it's basically a point of contentment. All right? That's one of the major differences between our Eastern religions and our Western religions. Eastern religion is all about contentment. Western religions are the ones who really focus on ecstasy and happiness forever, like Christianity or Islam. Right? And of course, here are the Chinese characters. What makes Chinese writing so interesting is that everyone in China can read the same writing. This symbol may be the symbol for dog, and everyone can read that as dog. But they have hundreds of different ways of pronouncing it. So Chinese people can't talk to one another, but they can write to one another. All right? And in Chinese language, you basically have to memorize thousands of characters. It's a very difficult language to master. All right, and as you can see, Buddhism, as it came through, went to China, eventually Japan. And the fat Buddha, I don't know if I mentioned it, Mahayana Buddhism is that easier form of Buddhism. Originally in Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, you had to live the life of Buddha, the ascetic lifestyle of giving up everything. All right, Buddha was not a fat guy. Buddha was a really skinny guy because he basically renounced food and pleasures and all that stuff. And that's how you reached enlightenment. With Mahayana Buddhism, the more popular version of Buddhism, all you have to do is pray to Buddha, and you can get enlightenment that way. All right, India. India, we call it a subcontinent because it actually did used to be apart from the rest of Asia, but also because it is so large and so separated geographically because of the Himalaya mountains. But one group did come into India around about 1400s BC, so about 3,500 years ago, called the Aryans. They were an Indo-European group that came out of the Caucasus Mountains and took over India. And what they did is they basically set up a system to keep them on top. They basically took the Brahmanism, the original religion of India, and kind of molded it into something they could use. So these are your three Hindu gods, the Vishnu, the creator, Shiva, the destroyer, and Brahma, the creator, Vishnu's the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer. And they set up a system where you're born into a caste. And the reason you're in that caste is because of what you did in your past life. So there's no way to move up and down in the Indian system in this life. But if you're a good person and follow your dharma and get good karma, you'll be rewarded in the next life. And vice versa, if you do bad things and don't follow your dharma, then you're punished in the next life. Of course, this was during early India. During the Mauryan Empire, which occurred right after Alexander the Great's failed invasion of India, you had a different religion being promoted by a guy named Ashoka. Ashoka promoted Buddhism. All right? Now, Buddhism had been around in India for a couple hundred years, but it was never very big. But Ashoka really liked Buddhism because after he took over Kalinga and killed 100,000 people, they say, he felt so bad that he started promoting this religion. And this is pretty much the height of Buddhism in India. After Ashoka, it really goes down. Here you can see the stupa and pillars that were so common during Ashoka's reign. He would write down his laws and ways of living on these pillars, and he had them posted in every Indian city and town. And a stupa is just a Buddhist holy building. This is the Gupta Empire. Now, this arises about 600 years after the Mauryan Empire. And the Gupta Empire was founded by Chandragupta. This was also founded by Chandragupta. This is the one that doesn't have a space in his name. This one does, right? And the Gupta Empire was also known for its tolerance of other religions. But what it's most known for is its science and math, all right? The numbers and the mathematics stuff we use today came from the Guptas, all right? The same little squiggles you make for numbers came out of India. All the advanced math came out of India. We call them Arabic numerals, but that's just because the Arabs got them from the Gupta Indians. The other neat thing is while the Gupta Empire was flourishing and going strong, and the rest of the world were looking at the Dark Ages. China was in a period of turmoil and chaos, the Han Dynasty had fallen, and of course Europe, the Roman Empire had fallen, and everything was all messed up. Greece. Now Greece we talk about a lot, largely because they're so influential on us. It's a small little country just in the south of Europe, but they had a lot of interesting ideas that no one really developed. They had a polytheistic religion, and you guys probably know all about Greek mythology and Zeus and Hera and all of that. And they had multiple different governments. Greece was not a unified country. Greece was basically a bunch of city-states. This is where a city is its own country. We still have a few of these today, like Vatican City and whatnot. And they had different ways of ruling them. An oligarchy is when noble families, pretty much a few people, run the city. A monarchy is when you have a set-up system to where one person is the monarch, and then his successor, usually his eldest son, is going to be the next monarch, and so it's just an accepted system that one family is going to rule. A tyranny is when you have one person come in and just take over. All right, he basically broke the rules and sets himself up, and there's no guarantee that his heir, his eldest son, is going to be the next ruler. Because once you set up that system, what do you now become? A monarchy. All right? And of course, democracy. And this was only found in one city-state in Greece, and that was Athens. It was a direct democracy, meaning that all free males had a voice in the government. And they could basically make laws. They held trials where anyone could go and basically vote someone's guilt or innocence. This is something we see that was quite common in most Greek cities. The amphitheater. They loved plays. All right, we have Sophocles, Euripides, all the various famous plays we talked about, Oedipus Rex, Medea, and the Greeks loved to go there and just listen to people perform. And this is also where you held a lot of your public events, the governing and all of that. I put this here to show you all the Greek math and science. The Greeks knew the earth was round. The Greeks knew sophisticated. Euclid developed over 400 different mathematical proofs that we still use today. Pretty much the building blocks of our math come out of these Greek scientists and thinkers, right? So they were a pretty intelligent bunch. And you guys all know this is a symbol of what?
Pi.
Which is used for calculating circles and spheres and other geometric forms. All right, so out of Greece we get Rome. Now Rome was in the Italian peninsula, which was very close to Greece, and they adopted most of the Greek religion and language and all of that. I mean, the Latin is based on Greek, the religion is based on Greek, the math and science, everything. But what the Romans did develop that was a unique thing to themselves was the republic, or the people's government. And in the republic, you basically had a representative system of government, which is our type of democracy, all right? And it worked pretty well in Rome. You had the upper class people who pretty much were always active in the government, the patricians, and here you can see the senators in the Senate wearing their togas. They were very good builders, the Romans. They used concrete. They're the first ones to figure out how to make limestone into concrete, and they built these wonderful buildings, very tall, using the arc, all right, which was a better archaeological structure than the Greek columns. They set up a system of government where you were innocent until proven guilty, and everyone was protected under the laws equally. Does this sound familiar to you? It should, because this is still our legal system today. Pretty much most of what we have today, we took from the Romans. And of course, the reason why they're so powerful, originally they're one city, but they had a very good military system organized under the Legion, where their style of fighting was so successful they were able to conquer the largest empire the world had seen to that point. And eventually they stopped having a republic and they started having emperors. Caesar was the first guy to really set up a dictator, but he was assassinated, so his adopted son, his nephew Augustus, ended up becoming really our first emperor. And from there on out, you pretty much are only talking Roman emperors. This is about 27 BCE. And of course, there we go. Christianity spread under the Roman Empire. For the first 300 years of existence, Christianity was a very small, insignificant cult out of the East. But it started becoming popular in Roman cities, particularly because of the new things it was preaching. And the older religions, guys, they never really talked about a heaven and an everlasting happiness. Christianity offered that, all right? Christianity was a religion that was much more appealing to the masses. In Greek and Roman religion, the gods never really concerned themselves much with who you were or what you did, unless you were a great and powerful person. Christianity says that God loves everyone equally. Well, that's very appealing to most people. So It was adopted by Constantine, who then made it a legal religion. Eventually, his grandson Theodosius makes it the only religion of the Roman Empire. And that's really how Christianity becomes so large. Here's the Pope. Of course, the Pope was the successor of Peter, who was supposedly Jesus' leader of the church after he died. And that's why the Pope claims authority over all Christians. But there was a rift in Christianity. The Eastern bishops didn't want to follow the Pope's lead, and that's why you have the two sects today of the Eastern Orthodox and the eastern part of Europe and the Middle East, and then, of course, the Catholics, which are in the West. Islam comes about 600 years after Christianity, and this is, of course, with the Prophet Muhammad, who lived right about here in a very arid region of Arabia, and he had a visitor from the Archangel Gabriel, who told him he was the last of the long line of God's prophets, and that he was to spread this new faith. And he did, as you can see by this drawing. This is upon Muhammad's death, how far they had taken over. Basically just a small segment of the Arabian Peninsula, which to most people at this time in history was nothing. I mean, Alexander the Great didn't even bother conquering it, because to him it was just a big desert. It wasn't even worth conquering. But from there, the Muslims basically took over a humongous empire, going from the Atlantic eventually all the way to the Pacific. All right? It becomes the biggest religion in the world in about 150 years. All right? It grew fast. And it is still today the fastest growing religion in the world. This is the Kaaba, which was the holy place of all Islamic people. This is where Muslims pray to 5 times a day. Don't forget your 5 pillars. To be a good Muslim, you have to believe in God, you have to give to the poor, you have to travel to Mecca on a Hajj or a pilgrimage, you have to feast, or not feast, you have to fast during the holy month of Ramadan. That basically means you're not eating during the day. And does they pray 5 times a day? Which one am I leaving off? All right, well, I got to move on. Sub-Saharan Africa. We didn't talk much about Sub-Saharan Africa throughout the year because we don't have a lot of history on them. There wasn't a lot of writing from Sub-Saharan Africa, so we don't really know a lot of what went on. But we do know that a lot of these African tribes here have similar language groups, and they're all descended from one group that came out of Western Africa, the Bantu. And the reason why the Bantu were able to take over all of Africa is because they had iron technology. The rest of Africans didn't. So if you have iron weapons and the other people are using wood weapons, you're going to win. The reason they spread so quickly is because of their slash and burn farming method. They constantly were cutting down forests, burning them down to plant new crops. And the reason you do that is because it nourishes the soil. But that only works once. And so pretty much you have to find new land to cut down and then use. And then you take over new land and new land. And that's why the Bantu spread across all of Africa. Now the one exception to the whole writing system in Sub-Saharan Africa is Axum. Axum was actually a Christian kingdom in East Africa. All right, Christian missionaries came into it, and this is, of course, after Jesus and everything. This is during Roman Empire. So you had Christian missionaries coming into East Africa, and they actually had a recorded history because they had the Bible and they adopted the writing systems of the Christians. And that's eventually going to fall, of course, when the Muslims take it over. You had a whole bunch of trade going on in East Africa because of the Indian Ocean trade networks. Don't forget about the monsoons, the seasonal winds that made it so easy to travel on the Indian Ocean. You could get to place quickly as long as you went at certain times of the year. We talked about the big West African civilizations, Ghana in the 11th and 10th century, Mali, and eventually Songhai, all in West Africa. We talked about the importance of the gold and salt trade. There's a lot of gold in West Africa, but what you needed to cross the desert to retain water was salt. And there's a lot of salt in Northwest Africa here. So you basically had huge caravan trades. And of course, this really didn't get going until you could use camels very well. So the camel saddles developed by the Berbers allowed for all that. You guys recognize this picture? Mansa Musa, right? He was the Mali king who basically introduced the world to West Africa and all the wealth that West Africa had. Since he had adopted Islam, Islam had permeated into West Africa, not through war, but through merchants. And a lot of people in West Africa adopted Islam, and they're still largely Islamic today. Well, Mansa Musa was a good Muslim, and all good Muslims are supposed to go on a Hajj to Mecca. So he made a pilgrimage with camels laden with gold. And when he arrived in these places in the Mediterranean, I don't have a good picture of the Mediterranean, but they just were amazed by how much gold he had. In fact, they talk about how the gold he brought into Europe and the Middle East pretty much offset the price of gold for the next 100 years. That's how much gold they're bringing in. And this was just a pittance of the gold he actually had. So really, if you looked at the amount of wealth he had, he's pretty much the wealthiest monarch in all the world at the time. Ibn Battuta is a name you should recognize. He's one of your key concepts. He was our famous explorer from Morocco. And he was able to travel all throughout Europe, into West Africa, East Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, India, and eventually China. And he made it all the way back home. And we know about it because he did what? He wrote it down. He is the greatest world traveler of all time. And he was able to do this because he was a Muslim, and he spoke Arabic. And most Muslims speak Arabic because they believe that in order to understand the words of Allah, you have to understand the language of Allah, which since Gabriel spoke in Arabic to Muhammad, obviously God likes Arabic, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the European Middle Ages were after the fall of the Roman Empire, not a lot of trade. You had the feudal system set up. This was a system set up for protection. Pretty much no big cities. Peasants worked small farms, and you worked for a knight. And that knight had gotten his position from a noble, a baron, and count, an earl, whoever. And that baron, count, and earl had gotten his land from a king. In this system, you basically give land for loyalty, all right? And the whole system was set up to produce knights, because knights were seen as the quintessential military element, and you had to have it to be protected. The church was very important during this period. The Middle Ages is a 1,000-year period where pretty much the only thing people were concerned with is getting to heaven. And the only way you could get to heaven was by getting the sacraments, basically baptism, forgiveness for your sins, communion, all these different things. And without these things, you were condemned to hell. And so that's why the church played such a huge role in medieval society. This is one of our medieval doctors. This is the suit a doctor would wear when he treated you. It was supposed to keep them safe from, well, they didn't know about germs, but from the diseases. And this became a common sight during the Black Plague. Remember, the plague comes through and kills over half the European population. We did have some large civilizations like the Holy Roman Empire, but for the most part, you're talking small monarchies up until the end of the Middle Ages. And of course, Christian Europe invaded the Middle East, starting in the 11th and 12th centuries. And this is when they got introduced to a lot of this knowledge of the outside world, and this leads eventually to the Renaissance. So for about 1,000 years, Europe was pretty much the dumbest place on the planet. Japan, we haven't talked much about it. It's an island chain off the east coast of China. It went through several different periods. Basically, Japan had copied everything from the Chinese up until the 20th century, all right? Really the late 19th, early 20th century. They adopted Chinese architecture. Their language is a derivation of the Chinese language. During the Nara period, they were very strong Buddhists. Eventually, the emperor got tired of the Buddhist monks telling them what to do. So during the Heian period is when they moved the capital away from the Buddhist monasteries. This was our period of all the exciting literature. You guys remember reading the Pillow Book of Lady Shonagon about all these sexual escapades of the Japanese nobility. And the fact that even women were literate. That it was women writing these stories. Things like the Tale of Genji, this Pillow Book of Lady Shonagon. These were all written by women. And in these books, you basically hear about people writing letters and poems all the time. That shows a very intelligent and literate society. But of course, this is really just the nobility. Poor peasants would still be toiling in the soil. They wouldn't have all this free time. Eventually, the military takes over, and we get the reign of the samurai during the shogunate period. The shogun was the military leader of all Japan, and Japan enters into this feudal stage where basically it's fighting amongst itself for a very long period until this guy, Tokugawa Ieyasu. He is the one who in the 15th century basically took over all of Japan, actually 16th century, and established the shogunate that was going to last up until the 19th century in the Meiji Japan. And in that system, pretty much, the warlords dominated everything. The Mongols. The Mongols came out of Central Asia. Now we've seen the Central Asian hordes cause all sorts of problems before, right? The Huns attacked China and India and they brought down the Roman Empire. We had others like the Xiongnu attacking people, disrupting trade. The Mongols were another one of these groups that to most people were just a nobody group. They're seen as ignorant, barbarians. But the Mongols did something that no one else had ever done. First and foremost, they conquered the largest empire the world's ever seen. And when they conquered it, they didn't just rape and pillage and leave it like that. They pretty much were favorable towards trade and also very tolerant of other cultures. The Mongols didn't care if you adopted their god. You could keep your gods because obviously your gods are weak anyway because they conquered you. And their sky god is the strongest god because they conquered whoever they wanted to. All they really cared about was you follow the rules and you pay your tribute. And every year the Mongols would come to collect their tribute, and as long as you paid the tribute, you were fine. If you didn't pay the tribute, they would kill you. Right. We get a great promotion of trade during this period. The Silk Road had been going on for a couple thousand years, but the Mongols really revived it because now you've got Mongol law and order all throughout here. Say what you will about the Mongols. Yes, they're horrible people when they conquer you. They will burn down a village and cut out the eyeballs of every living thing if you resist them. But they keep law and order, and you did not want to violate rules in the Mongol Empire. And so trade flourished because people didn't worry as much about bandits and everything else. These are the different khanates. After the death of Genghis Khan, and you basically get the Mongol Empire breaking up into pieces. The Yuan dynasty was established by his grandson Kublai Khan, this guy right here, who actually Netflix has a series about. Anyone watched it?
No.
It's pretty good. We know so much about it because of the travels of Marco Polo, who supposedly visited China at this time. A lot of people doubt he actually did. But still, the fact that he wrote a book about visiting China and all the wealth of China really is what caused the Europeans to want to visit China and India and trade with them. The Americas. We haven't said anything about the Americas yet because we don't really know a lot about them, but we'll start with our oldest civilization, and that's the Olmecs. And the things the Olmecs, which is a Mesoamerican civilization, have left us are these big giant heads. And they have lots of them all throughout the area. And that's really what they've left us. We don't have a lot of writing or anything else. The other thing they've left us is a lot of ball cords. All right? They were the only ones who had rubber. And they made these rubber balls that were very hard and heavy. And you had to get the ball through the hoop, and it was a religious, spiritual thing. A lot of times the losers and sometimes the winners were sacrificed to the gods. Human sacrifice, quite common in Mesoamerican and American cultures in general. They built step pyramids like this one here at Chichen Itza. This is a Mayan pyramid. They were built at a particular angle with the sun. The Mayans were very good astronomers, very good mathematicians. Their civilization flourished over 2,000 years ago. They were a city-state civilization as well. This is the Mayan calendar, which was also adopted by the Aztecs. And they used it to predict things like solar eclipses and whatnot. And more famously, the fact that they predicted the whole world was going to end back in 2012, which it did. This is a picture of the Aztecs sacrificing somebody. You guys remember the Aztecs actually migrated into the Valley of Mexico, took over the region, and they cut out people's hearts and showed it up to the sun because everyone knows that if the sun doesn't get a freshly heart sacrificed to it each day, it's not going to rise. All right, and this is why the Aztecs were so warlike. They're constantly taking prisoners to sacrifice. This is someone from the Incan Empire. The Incans were known for a couple things. They lived in a very mountainous terrain, so they used terrace farming. They're the ones who cultivated the potato, which we love so much. The Mesoamericans had maize or corn. And they were also very good weavers, all right? They didn't have a writing system. They used the quipu, which was a system of knots and colored string to keep track of things. And they were also very warlike like the Aztecs. They conquered a huge empire. They were also the first ones to set up a welfare system. Pretty much in the Incan Empire, everyone paid money to the government so that the government could then help people in the different parts of the empire who didn't have, let's say like you had a famine or a flood or a landfill or whatever. Renaissance. The Renaissance starts after the Middle Ages. This comes from all the information flowing into Europe, particularly into Italy, because Italy had so many city-states that were trading with the Muslims and getting this information. Also because Italy used to be the center of the Roman Empire, and they had wealthy merchants who could afford to, promote the arts and whatnot. And if you notice, Italy wasn't a unified country, and had all these different little countries inside it. This is probably our most famous Renaissance thinker. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. We call him a Renaissance man because he wasn't just a great painter, he was also a scientist, a great writer, philosopher, everything. The Renaissance was basically a rejection of the spiritual. In the Middle Ages, all anyone cared about was God and how do you get to heaven. Renaissance people start focusing on humanity itself. How can we make ourselves better? How can we make the world better? All right? And when you start focusing on things that are here and not things that are up there, you're talking about the secular. And humanism is just this philosophy that you glorify human potential. What can make humans better? And of course, what they came to conclude was it's education. That's the way we better ourselves. This is the famous picture from the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo painted. This is basically on a roof, on a ceiling, high up in the air. And during this period, the scientific revolution is going on, and they start trying to answer things using the scientific method, which means using observation. If you couldn't observe it and see it, then you didn't worry about it. The only things you could test are things you could observe, things you could prove. That's what mattered. That is a new way of looking at the world, guys. Because all throughout the Middle Ages, people just believed whatever they were told to believe. Now, people are saying, no, I'll believe what you can prove to me. Age of exploration. The Europeans start becoming the world's great sailors. For the longest time, Europe hadn't really been, big on trading and traveling far from Europe. But they basically took the knowledge of the Chinese and the Muslims, and they used it to become the greatest sailors the world has seen up to this date. This, of course, is the famous Christopher Columbus. He thought the world was only this big, and so he thought by sailing west he could get to the east, but of course instead he discovered this brand new set of continents, although he thought he was in India because he called the people he met Indians, even though they're not. This is a picture of the caravel. This is the new style of ship they utilize. The Portuguese were the first ones to build these. It's a ship that basically can sail around the world. It's got all the advancements needed, deep draft, the lateen and the square sails, to make the voyage. This is Vasco da Gama. He was the first Portuguese guy to sail around Africa to India and back. Remember, their main goal was to make it to the east to get silks and spices. All right? Trade was the main thing. But you had the 3 G's driving them. Gold, God, and glory. You want to get rich, you want to get famous, and you want to spread the religion. What ends up happening, probably the biggest effect from all of this, is the Columbian Exchange. North and South America, that have been so isolated for so long, are transformed because of this. All right? The Europeans get a lot of good foods, tomato, potato, corn, lots of good stuff out of the Americas. But what they bring to the Americas are things that pretty much decimated the Americans. They bring diseases like smallpox that wiped out over 90% of the Native American population. They bring lots of new animal species like pigs and horses and cows, things these Native Americans never seen. And they pretty much end up wiping out a lot of the native species as well. And of course, they bring a lot of new people. If you come to the Americas today, you're going to see a lot of Europeans, a lot of Africans, not so many Native Americans. All right? It's basically a continent that's been repopulated with people from different parts of the world. Muslim empires. We talked about how Islam, guys, for a long time was the most advanced, literate, tolerant civilizations in the world. The last 3 great ones were the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. Mughals in India, Safavid what's today Iran, and of course the Ottoman was North Africa, Southeastern Europe, and the Middle East. This is probably our most famous of these rulers of the great empires, Suleiman the Magnificent, who is named so because he was not just a great military ruler, but also a great lawgiver and leader of his people. This is an example of Islamic architecture. This is Taj Mahal, built in the Mughal Empire by Shah Abbas for his wife Mumtaz Mahal after she died, so it's a mausoleum for his dead wife. They were big traders in spices and other things, and were making humongous sums of money up until the Age of Exploration, because all of these empires sat along the Silk Road, and so all the massive trade coming out of the east had to go through them. Once the Europeans start trading directly with China and India, and they can bypass these Muslim civilizations, that's when these start to decline. But at the time, guys like Suleiman the Magnificent were the richest guys in the world, because they controlled all this trade. This is the Hagia Sophia, originally built by Justinian to be the world's biggest church, the most glorious church, and it was for hundreds of years. Eventually, though, the Ottomans took it over in 1452, and it became the mosque that it is today. The reason why these guys were all successful is because they had gunpowder. Gunpowder had been invented in China, but the Chinese never utilized it to its best extent, which is the use of firearms. All 3 of these Muslim empires erupted because they had guns, and they were able to take over people who didn't have guns. And the Janissaries. This is the famous fighting force of the Ottomans that was only loyal to the Sultan. They were made up of the Christian groups in the Ottoman Empire. Basically, Christian villages had to pay tribute in boys, basically. So they would come around, they'd pick the best looking guys, and those guys would then serve the Sultan and his military force. And you could rise up and eventually become a great governor in the Ottoman Empire, even if you were a lowly janissary. And this is an example, again, of the tolerance. In Muslim empires, it didn't matter what religion you were not going to be killed for your religion. All right? That's unlike Europe, where if you even had the slightest derivation of religion, they killed you and tortured you. Okay, China. We didn't spend much time on China, but we just need to know Shang Dynasty is our first one. Eventually we get the Warring States period. Qin Dynasty is the first one that really united China. That's where we get the name China. This is Shi Huangdi. The Han Dynasty is our first big China, promoting trade. Buddhism starts spreading. The Confucian testing system is set up where you start rewarding people for being intelligent and hardworking. We call this a meritocracy. This is what made China so prosperous. When you have your most intelligent and hardworking people in positions of power, it didn't matter where you came from in society. If you were intelligent and hardworking, you were given a good job, and you pushed up the ladder. After the Han falls, we get the Sui, who built the Grand Canal connecting all the rivers of China. Eventually the Tang Dynasty China, which people often say is the highlight of Chinese civilization. This is 600 to the 900s when you're talking Chinese just being the most literate, prosperous. You get things like paper money coming out of Tang China, the printing press, gunpowder, all these new inventions. Eventually, it breaks up. We get the Song Dynasty in the south, which was conquered by the Mongols, establishing the Yuan Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty was the bringing back of everything Chinese for the Chinese. You guys probably don't remember this guy, but his name's Zheng He. He was our famous Chinese explorer. Remember how I said the Chinese were almost 200 years ahead of the Europeans in technology and sailing and everything else? He was our great maritime explorer for the Chinese. He only made 7 expeditions. He went as far as Africa, Arabia, India. If they would have kept at it, the Chinese would have been the dominant power in world history. No doubt in my mind. No doubt in most historians' mind. But they decided to stop trading with the outside world and focus themselves inward. Instead of building ships, they started building the Great Wall again, which was just a really bad idea. Great walls don't make money. Trading vessels make money. So this is when we pretty much see China could have been super awesome, didn't end up being so. You guys remember the picture where you had the ships of the Chinese, how huge they were compared to the little European sailing vessels? Eventually we get the Qing dynasties. These were the Manchurians who took over the Ming dynasty. They were basically seen as outsiders by other Chinese, and this is going to be our last dynasty that falls in 1911. Spanish Americas were set up. When Spain took over the Americas, they first wanted all the gold and silver, but once they'd gotten all that, they realized they could still get money through cash crops. They set up a system based totally on race. Basically, if you were white and born in Spain, the Peninsulares, you were at the top of society. If you were European descent but not born in Europe, you were a Creole, which means you're middle level. A lot of these Europeans intermarried with the Native Americans and African slaves who've been brought in, so these are your mestizos and mulattoes. It's probably the largest group in the Americas. And then, of course, at the bottom, you have the Native Americans, who were oftentimes treated very, very poorly. Oh, and your African slaves. The Enlightenment. This is a period where the Europeans are basically questioning their leadership. They just learned all this stuff with the scientific revolution. Guys like Rousseau and John Locke and Voltaire and Wollstonecraft and Beccaria questioning how the government should be run, arguing that people should be treated equally, that power doesn't derive from God, like they've been saying for thousands of years with divine right, that power derives from the people. So we get revolutions in this period. We get the French Revolution, that here's the famous guillotine for cutting off people's heads. Now the French Revolution, while it didn't prove successful in the short term, it did prove successful in the long term because it spread these ideals of the Enlightenment around Europe and eventually the world, and most people base their governments on these Enlightenment ideals now. The American Revolution had, of course, happened, and we became a country at this time. And this is Toussaint Louverture, leader of the Haitian Revolution. Haiti became a democracy at this time under him. And this is Simón Bolívar, probably the most famous Latin American revolutionary. Remember, during the wars of Napoleon in Europe, the Latin American countries like Mexico and Brazil and all these other countries used this opportunity to get their independence. So, Europeans have started establishing empires all around the world. Here's that famous caricature of China, and there's the Chinese empire basically being divided by all the Europeans. You see this guy represents Britain, basically claiming all these territories. This represents the Belgians taking over the Congo and how abusive they were to the natives. And you had two different types of systems. Europeans sometimes had direct control, where they totally controlled the governments of these civilizations, and sometimes they had indirect control. You let them keep their king, but you basically tell the kings what to do. And as you can see, most of the world came under the control of the Europeans. Latin America stayed independent, but they were economically dominated by people like the United States. Napoleon, while his empire didn't last very long, like I said, the fact that he spread Enlightenment ideals with the Napoleonic Code led to all sorts of revolutions across Europe in the 19th century, 1830 and 1848 revolutions being the most famous. This is Karl Marx. He was our writer who came up with the idea of communism, the idea that you shouldn't have all the wealth in just the small percentage, the top people's hands, that wealth should be shared equally with everybody. And this became a very popular idea in the 20th century. World War I happens because of all these European nations becoming so powerful. Nationalism, imperialism, militarism, all these different isms we talked about, how competitive they were. And it all started with the spark of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. You had two groups. You had the Central Powers, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, against the Allies, who were the British, the French, the Russians, pretty much everyone else in the world. The Germans came close to winning, but they lost. What World War I showed us was that how bad war was going to be from here on out. The massive amount of deaths you're going to see. And you get things like poison gas, tanks, submarines, all of that. This was really our first worldwide scale war, besides, unless you're going to talk about the 7 Years' War. In the interwar period, we had the Russian Revolution. Remember Lenin and Stalin spreading these ideas, the 5-year plans. You had all sorts of new discoveries about the scientific world. You had Sigmund Freud discovering things about the psychology of ourselves, Albert Einstein questioning the rules of the universe. And this caused people really to question their own selves. You get existentialism, basically this new philosophy that the only thing that matters is what you think matters, that you basically make your own reasons for existence. You also get new ideas about government. A lot of people were questioning democracy at this time. So you get guys, fascist leaders like Hitler, who say that the greatest thing is to glorify a race, not the individual. And this, of course, leads to World War II and massive bombings. World War II was a war even worse than World War I as far as deaths are concerned, because in World War I, most people dying were soldiers. In World War II, cities were being targeted and civilians were being wiped out in large numbers. More civilians died in World War II by far than soldiers. All right? Entire cities. This is the city of Dresden in Germany. One night we firebombed it and pretty much destroyed the whole city. Killed tens of thousands of people. And of course we developed the atomic bomb by the end of the war, which was used to kill tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. This is, of course, this flag of the Japanese Empire. And these wars led to a renewed bout of feminism. Because of World War I, most countries in Europe and America gave women the right to vote. Right? It probably would have happened eventually. Of course, it would happen eventually, but this really sped it along. Cold War. Cold War is a period of ill will between the Russians and the Americans. The blue countries here are basically the ones that were allied to the Western powers, the democratic capitalists, and the reddish countries are the ones that were more aligned to the communists. And as you can see, most of the region they disputed was the Third World. Here you see Kennedy and Khrushchev. This is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest thing we've ever come to killing each other, and they're both about to blow up the world with hydrogen bombs. The wars we did get involved in, things like Vietnam, in Korea, we're fighting the third world countries to try and keep them from going communist, and of course we're capitalists, they're communists. And you also end up getting a lot of religious fundamentalists at this time. This is the Ayatollah who emerged as the leader of Iran. We have a lot of problems in the 21st century going forward. We've got the third world still starving. Most of the people of the world live in these very poor countries. They can't feed their entire populace. We've got global pollution. We're creating more greenhouse gases than we ever had. It's only getting worse. Even with all, we started seeing some benefits in the 1980s with Arbor Day and all the new restrictions we have on our agencies that can't pollute as much as they could have. But Third world countries, guys, are still just kicking out pollution like crazy. And this is causing the planet to get hotter, which is causing all sorts of problems as far as famine and death. We still have worldwide epidemics, things like Ebola, HIV, things like this that are killing lots of people. We have overpopulation, largely because of the third world. Most of your wealthy nations aren't growing anymore. We pretty much have reached the point where we don't have kids. We keep the population steady and that's about it. Third world countries just keep growing exponentially. And we're running out of resources to feed everybody. All right, so that's a huge problem. And of course, we've seen a lot of genocide in the 20th and 21st century. We talked about the Armenian massacre in World War I, the Holocaust in World War II, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, people killing off whole other groups of people simply because of their race. And that's it. All right. Any questions?